The scissors bit down hard. That crunch tore through the quiet street like a bone snapping. The first lock of Leora's hair, black and shining, tumbled into the dust. The crowd gasped, a single sharp breath, as if they'd just watched a body fall from a rope. She sat on an overturned crate, the one they'd forced her onto. Her wrists were tied with coarse rope that bit into her skin, her jaw clenched so tight it ached. But you could see the fight in her, in the rise and fall of her chest with each ragged breath. Kids pressed in close, their eyes wide, not with fear, but with a hungry, morbid delight. And their mothers, instead of shielding them from the ugliness, pulled them nearer. They whispered in their ears, "This is what pride gets you." The barber's hand shook as he brought the scissors up again. He was just a man trying to make a living, but Sheriff Hale's glare was like a brand on his back. He had no choice. He snipped again. Strands fell faster now, a dark storm of shorn hair gathering at her feet. "Vanity stripped clean," Sheriff Hale barked, his voice thick and wet with his own righteousness. "So the town may see her for what she really is." Leora flinched as another lock was yanked free. Her scalp burned. Tears stung the corners of her eyes, hot and sharp, but she wouldn't let them fall. She would not give them that. Not that. The crowd jeered. "She thought herself too fine for us," a woman screeched. "Let's see her smile now," a man bellowed from the saloon doorway. "Let's see her without her crown." A young boy, no older than 10, darted forward. He snatched a single long strand from the pile on the ground. He waved it like a trophy, a flag of her defeat, before dropping it back in the dirt for the heavy boots to grind into nothing. Laughter exploded, raw and eager and cruel. It was a sound that could curdle milk. The barber, emboldened by the noise, grew rougher. His hands stopped shaking. The cuts became jagged, uneven chunks, hacking away until her once beautiful hair, the hair her mother had told her was a record of her life, clung in ragged, pathetic tufts to her head. Leora squeezed her eyes shut. She tried to hear her mother's voice, not the jeering of the mob. "Never cut it, my love. Each strand carries a memory. Your dignity is woven into it like thread." The memory was a knife twisting in her gut. From the saloon, a drunkard shouted the words that sealed it. "Cut it all! Leave her bare as shame itself!" The last length of hair fell, hacked off, crude. It scattered across the dusty road. And for a moment, a heavy silence fell over the square. The only sound was the grinding of boots, pressing the last of her pride deeper into the filth of the street. Leora's head felt strange, naked. The air was raw against her scalp. She was trembling, a leaf in a storm. But she held herself upright. Her bound hands were clenched into fists so tight her knuckles were white. The sheriff raised his voice again, pointing a thick finger at the pile of black silk at her feet. "There lies her pride. Let the wind carry it away. She has nothing left." The crowd laughed again, but it was different this time. Beneath the noise, a murmur stirred. Some folks looked uneasy. Her stillness, her refusal to break and weep before them, was more unsettling than any tears could ever be. It was like watching a statue bleed. The barber stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow. He muttered that the work was done, that he'd done what was asked. Sheriff Hale shoved Leora from the crate. Hard. She fell to her knees, right into the pile of her own shorn hair. Dust puffed up around her. The strands she had brushed and cared for every morning now clung to her tear-streaked skin like dirt. The people hooted at the sight of her, bowed and broken. But she wasn't broken. She bit her lip until she tasted blood, but she did not cry out. A stone, small and sharp, skittered across the road, thrown by some boy made brave by the mob. It struck her on the shoulder. She swayed, but she did not fall. Hale sneered, folding his thick arms across his chest. He was sure the humiliation was complete. His work was done, but he was wrong. Even as the crowd roared, a shadow shifted at the edge of the street. A tall figure had stopped just where the blinding sunlight met the shade of the boardwalk. His eyes weren't on the sheriff. They weren't on the jeering crowd. They were fixed on the hair, the beautiful dark hair scattered in the dust. He didn't move. Not yet. But just the sight of him standing there sent a strange ripple through the crowd. A sudden weight, heavier than the sheriff's angry voice. Leora couldn't see him through the blur of her unshed tears. But she felt it, a change in the air, as if the ground itself had held its breath, waiting to witness what came next. The crowd was still howling, their jeers as thick as the dust in the air. That's when the tall stranger finally stepped forward. His boots made a solid thud on the boardwalk before sinking into the soft dust of the street. He didn't speak. He didn't even spare the sheriff or the trembling barber a single glance. His gaze stayed locked on the strands of hair scattered at Leora's knees, glinting like black ribbons in the dirt. Murmurs rippled through the people. He bent low, the sun catching the hard lines of his weathered face. For the first time all day, someone blocked the crowd's view of her. His broad shoulders were like a shield. His hands, calloused and rough, reached for the strands. He started gathering them one by one. Gently, he brushed aside the dirt, ignoring the heavy boots that had tried to grind them into powder. The people hissed in disbelief. "What's he doing?" a woman whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. "Leave it there," a man snarled. "It's filth now." But the stranger ignored them all. He was as steady and focused as if his task were sacred, as if he were gathering fallen stars instead of ruined hair. Leora blinked through her hazy vision, her breath caught tight in her throat. No one had lifted a hand for her. No one had spoken a single kind word. But this man, this total stranger, was now kneeling in the same dust where she knelt. His fingers were cradling the pieces of her shame as if they were spun gold. A woman in the crowd scoffed loudly. "He must be mad, touching what's been cursed." Another man laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Maybe he wants a keepsake of her vanity." The sheriff's voice cut through the noise, sharp with fury. "Get up, cowboy. That dirt isn't yours to clean." But the man didn't move any faster, or any slower. He just continued his patient work, his rough palm sweeping every last strand into his grasp. His patience was a weapon, and it made the jeers falter and die in their throats. Leora felt a strange heat rush to her face. It wasn't shame, not this time. It was something else, something she couldn't name. A tremor deep in her chest that somehow steadied her, that fought back against the rope biting into her wrists. She whispered, her voice hoarse and cracked, "Why? Why would you do this?" He gave no answer. He just pressed the gathered hair together gently, tucking the loose strands into the safety of his hand as if he were gathering the tattered threads of a broken flag. The crowd pushed closer, angry at his silence. They were hungry to break the stillness he carried with him like a coat. A boy tried to stomp near them, to kick dirt over the remaining strands, but the cowboy's head snapped up. His eyes were as dark as storm clouds on the horizon, and the boy, without a single word being spoken, stumbled back as if he'd been struck. Gasps rolled through the people. They were unsettled by a calm that was somehow fiercer than any rage they had ever seen. Sheriff Hale stepped off the porch. His hand was resting on the butt of his revolver, his jaw clenched tight. "Last warning, stranger," he growled. "Leave it in the dirt, or you'll lie there with it." Leora shuddered, her body tense, her scalp burning with the phantom weight of what had been stolen from her. And yet she found herself leaning toward this stranger, desperate for him not to rise, desperate for him to finish what he had begun. The cowboy's jaw flexed, but he did not lift his eyes from the last few strands he was gathering. Slowly, deliberately, he stood up. His height cast a long shadow over Leora, protecting her from the harsh sun. The cut hair was clutched carefully against his chest. The street felt deathly quiet. The only sounds were the creak of a distant wagon and the lonely flap of a torn banner in the wind. In his silence there was a defiance greater than any shout, greater than any curse. Leora's breath shook in her chest. Her knees pressed hard into the dust. The whole town leaned forward, waiting, waiting for the sheriff's gun to settle what pride could not. Sheriff Hale's spurs rang like a death knell against the porch steps as he advanced into the street. His hand was heavy on the revolver at his hip. His eyes were narrowed to angry slits beneath the wide brim of his hat. The crowd was hushed now, hungry for blood, eager to see what this silent defiance would cost. Leora trembled on her knees, her scalp raw, the ragged tufts of her shorn hair stirring in the hot breeze. But her eyes clung to the cowboy. He was standing tall beside her, the stolen strands of her hair pressed to his chest as if they were holy relics, pulled from sacred ground. "Stranger!" Hale barked, his voice echoing across the silent square. You've made a big mistake stepping into this street today. That filth you're holding belongs in the gutter. And if you don't drop it right now, I'll put you in the dirt right beside it. A ripple of nervous laughter surged from the saloon door. Men shouted encouragement to the sheriff. Women pressed closer, not wanting to miss a thing. Children craned their necks to see. The cowboy finally lifted his gaze. It was calm, unhurried. His eyes were dark and steady, like a deep river that had never known a drought. He didn't speak, not yet. He just looked at the sheriff, measuring him, as if sizing up a man who had already been found wanting. And that silence, that calm, assessing silence, rattled Sheriff Hale worse than any threat could have. What's your name? The sheriff demanded, trying to seize back control of the moment, of his town. The man's voice came out low and even, but it was firm enough to cut the air without ever being raised. Colt Mercer, the crowd muttered. Some of them recognized the name. They'd heard it in whispers, tales of cattle drives and fights won in towns far from here. Others just spat in the dust, disbelieving that some nameless drifter would dare defy the law. Hale's lip curled into a sneer. Then remember it when the ground takes you, Mercer. Now drop the hair. Colt's fingers flexed around the dark strands. His stance was steady, his boots planted deep in the dust. No? The single word struck the air sharper than a whip. Gasps rose from the crowd. Women clutched their shawls. Men growled that the stranger had just signed his own death warrant. The sheriff's hand twitched, hovering over his revolver. But he didn't draw. Not yet. The crowd's sudden silence was heavy, and he could see a flicker of doubt in the eyes of his own deputies. Leora's breath caught in her lungs. Her wrists ached against the rough rope. She had never heard a single word sound so final, so immovable. She had never seen a man wear his stillness like a shield. Hale snarled, stepping closer. His shadow fell across Colt's face. You think one word makes you stronger than the law? That hair is nothing, and the woman it came from is less than nothing. Shame and rage burned in Leora's chest like a hot coal, but Colt's reply was as calm and steady as a stone. If it was nothing, Sheriff, he said, his voice even, you wouldn't be so afraid of me holding it. The murmur in the crowd surged again, sharper this time. Heads turned. Some faces went pale. Because truth, when it's spoken that plainly, has a way of sounding like thunder. Hale's face went purple with rage. Sweat glistened on his brow. He couldn't take it anymore. He yanked the revolver from its holster. The steel gleamed in the harsh afternoon sun. Leora gasped, her cry lost in the roar of voices from the crowd. People surged forward, torn between their bloodlust and a strange new sense of awe. The sheriff leveled the barrel of the gun right at Colt's chest. The hammer was cocked back. His finger was tight on the trigger. The whole square held its breath, waiting for the shot that would shatter everything. The world seemed to shrink, collapsing around the two men in the dusty street. The sheriff's revolver was aimed directly at Colt Mercer's heart. The air was so taut, so tight, that even the restless children were silent now, clinging to their mother's skirts. Leora was still on her knees in the dirt. Strands of her shorn hair were scattered around her like dark ashes. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she stared at the man who stood unflinching before death itself. The bundle of her hair still clutched firmly in his hand. Sheriff Hale's voice cracked the hush like a whip. Drop it, Mercer, or I swear to God the dirt drinks your blood today. The crowd murmured. Some were eager for the crack of gunfire. Others shifted uneasily. They were starting to notice that the sheriff's hand was shaking, just a little, but it was there. And the sweat beating on his temple looked a lot more like fear than it did fury. Colt's voice came out low and steady, as if he wasn't speaking to the man in front of him, but to the very earth beneath his feet. You can shoot me, Sheriff, he said, but even if I fall, this hair won't scatter where you want it to. It will stay with me. He lifted the bundle of strands slightly. It wasn't a boast. It was a quiet promise, and a ripple of profound unease passed through the people. His calm bent the sheriff's threat into something smaller, something hollow and weak. Hale snarled, jabbing the gun forward. But Colt didn't flinch. His boots seemed rooted to the ground, as though the dust itself refused to let him be moved. Leora's eyes burned. The tears she had sworn not to shed were stinging her lashes. Because in that man's stillness, she saw not pity, but a strength she had never been offered in her life. And it shook her more than the gun ever could. From the saloon doorway, a drunk barked, "Shoot him already!" Laughter followed, brittle and weak, a desperate attempt to mask the dread that was now crawling over the crowd like a sickness. The sheriff's jaw clenched, his finger tightening on the trigger. But then, a new voice rose, sharp and clear, from the throng of people. "He won't shoot!" Every head turned. Murmurs swelled. "He knows too many people are watching," the voice continued. Hale's face went even darker, a mixture of fury at being exposed and raw fear. He swung the barrel of his gun toward the voice in the crowd. But in that one instant of distraction, Colt moved. He stepped forward, closing the distance by a single pace. His shadow stretched out, covering Leora completely, as if to shield her from the world. Gasps erupted. The crowd recoiled. No one had ever dared to step closer to the sheriff when a gun was drawn. Colt's voice cut through the din, iron and calm. "If the law is nothing but shame and cruelty, Sheriff, then your badge is nothing but a piece of tin." The words struck deeper than any bullet could. Here and there in the crowd, some people nodded. Whispers of agreement started to rise. The sheriff's authority, built on a foundation of fear, was starting to crumble under the weight of a stranger's plain-spoken truth. Hale's hand was shaking harder now, the gun wavering. Sweat dripped from his temple onto his dusty shirt. "Still," he barked, desperate. "One more step and I'll—" His threat broke off. Because Leora, trembling but fierce, was rising unsteadily to her feet. The rope was still binding her wrists. Her shorn head was bare to the sun. And she spoke, her voice hoarse, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "Then shoot us both," she said. "But you'll never cut me down smaller than you already have." Her words hung in the air like a bell toll across the square, silencing even the cruelest mouths. And for the first time, Sheriff Hale faltered. His gun wavered, not from choice, but from the sudden, crushing weight of doubt. Sheriff Hale's hand trembled, the revolver in his fist wavering as the murmurs in the crowd surged like waves. He saw faces that were pale with shock, others hard with a new and dangerous doubt. And he knew in that gut-twisting moment that if he did nothing, their silence would drown him. With a snarl, he shoved the pistol back into its holster. He barked at his deputies, his voice strained. "Bring me a torch. If her pride won't burn from her head, we'll burn it from the ground." The words struck the crowd like a stone thrown into still water. Gasps broke into cruel, relieved laughter as one of the deputies rushed to the blacksmith's forge. He came back holding a brand, its tip glowing with a hungry orange heat. Leora staggered, her stomach lurching. She understood before anyone else did. He wasn't going to just discard the hair. He was going to burn the hair that Colt still held. He was going to turn her last shred of dignity into smoke and ash. "No!" she choked out, stepping forward despite the ropes that bound her. But her voice was swallowed by the roar of approval as the torch was brought near, its flames spitting angry sparks into the air. Hale jabbed a fat finger at Colt. "Drop it in the fire, Mercer, or you'll join her shame." The deputy thrust the torch close. The heat licked at the strands of hair, and for the first time Colt's hand shifted, not to release the hair, but to press it tighter against his chest. His eyes were dark with something that made even the deputies hesitate. "This doesn't belong to you," he said at last. His voice was low, but it was clear, and it carried above all the noise. "It doesn't belong to the gutter, or the fire, or your badge. It belongs to her, and it stays with us." The words rolled, heavy and final, through the square. They stunned the laughter into silence. His calm was fiercer than any shout they'd ever heard. Leora's breath caught, her knees weak, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. No one had ever spoken up for her, not once in her entire life. And now this stranger stood with her broken hair in his hands and declared it sacred. Some in the crowd shifted uneasily, glancing at one another. They were no longer sure if they wanted to mock something that had been claimed with such profound steadiness. Hale's face darkened with pure rage. The torch shook in his deputy's grip. He spat on the ground. "You dare speak for her? You dare defy me in front of this entire town?" Colt didn't move. He didn't flinch. His voice was still as steady as stone. "No, Sheriff," he said. "I don't speak for her. I speak against you." The hush deepened. The crowd was no longer jeering. They were waiting. They were caught between the familiar weight of authority and the shocking new power of truth. Hale, cornered by his own boiling fury, ripped the torch from his deputy's hand. He lunged, trying to press the flame against the bundle of hair himself. Gasps erupted. A woman screamed. Leora cried out in desperation. But Colt's free hand shot out, as fast and strong as iron. It caught Hale's wrist, holding it still, even as the fire spat sparks just inches from his own chest. For a single breathless heartbeat, they were locked together. Lawman and stranger. The torch sputtered between them. The crowd was frozen. The faint, acrid stench of singed hair rose in the air. Then Hale roared, twisting, his face purple, his teeth bared. The mob leaned forward, desperate to see who would yield first. The torch hissed and spat sparks as Sheriff Hale strained, his wrist locked tight in Colt Mercer's grip. Their faces were inches apart. The crowd roared with each shift and strain, as if they were watching a cockfight. The heat licked at Colt's sleeve. Smoke began to curl from the fabric, but he held fast. His arm was as steady as a granite pillar, while Hale's face turned redder and redder with the effort. Leora's cry pierced the din, her bound hands tugging uselessly at the rope, terror tearing her throat raw. But Colt's gaze never wavered from the sheriff's eyes. With a grunt of effort, Colt twisted. He wrenched the torch free from the sheriff's grasp, and in one swift, powerful motion, he drove its burning tip down into the dirt. He ground it out beneath his boot until the flame choked and died. A wave of gas rippled through the square. Some voices rose in outrage, others in stunned awe. The silence that followed was heavier than the smoke that drifted slowly upward. Hale staggered back, his chest heaving, his badge glinting dully in the pale morning light. His deputies hovered uncertainly, unwilling to move against a man who had just snuffed out their sheriff's fire with such calm finality. Colt bent down. He lifted the strands of hair again and held them close. The ends were stained with ash, but they were not burned. "Still whole," he murmured. It wasn't to the crowd, it was to the woman kneeling in the dirt, and Leora felt those two words strike her deeper than a hymn, steadier than a prayer. The crowd murmured, and she could see shame creeping into some of their eyes. But others hissed louder, unwilling to let go of their cruelty. "He can't keep them!" someone shouted. "Make her eat them!" Laughter burst out, harsh and brittle, a desperate sound trying to cover the unease that now ran through the square like a fever. Hale, utterly humiliated, bellowed, "You see him! He defies the badge! He defies the law!" But none of his men moved, not right away. Colt's silence weighed heavier than any law they knew. At last, two deputies lunged, but Colt stepped back, placing himself squarely in front of Leora. His hand brushed her shoulder for the first time. It was a shield, as natural and instinctive as breathing. The deputies faltered. They saw no wild rage in his eyes. They saw a deep, profound calm that promised terrible violence, but only if it was forced. Leora lifted her head. Her eyes were burning, her scalp was raw, but her spine was straighter than it had been since the first snip of the scissors. "You've taken enough," she rasped, her voice hoarse but clear. The crowd stilled at her words. They had expected defiance from a stranger. They had never expected it from the woman they had already cut down. Hale's fury boiled over. He drew his revolver again, the steel gleaming as he roared. "Then you'll both swing at dawn!" Gasps erupted. Children whimpered. Whispers darted through the crowd like sparks, some fearful, some thrilled by the promise of more bloodshed. But Colt's voice cut through it all, steady and low. "If you hang us for this, Sheriff, then this whole town will hang with us, because every single one of you saw what was done here today, and you said nothing." His words struck them like stones cast into a pond. Ripples of guilt spread fast. Faces paled as the truth clawed at their pride. Hale's hand shook, his finger tightening on the trigger. But before he could fire, a stone clattered across the dirt. It wasn't thrown at Colt. It was thrown at Sheriff Hale himself, striking his boot with a dull thud. The crowd gasped as one. Heads snapped toward where the stone had come from, and Hale's eyes widened with rage and disbelief. Because he understood in that one instant that his town was beginning to turn against him. The stone striking Sheriff Hale's boot cracked the square open like thunder. The uneasy hush that followed was louder than any jeer had been. Hale's face twisted with pure fury, his revolver jerking upward as he screamed, "Who dares?" But no one spoke. No one stepped forward. And in their collective silence, the first splinter of rebellion was born. Leora swayed on her feet, her wrists raw from the rope, her scalp burning where the ragged tufts of hair clung. But her eyes widened at the shift in the air. She saw shoulders that had been proud now hunched in shame. She saw glances that darted away, as if guilt had finally pricked the heart of the mob. Colt Mercer stood unmoved, the strands of her hair still gathered in his hand. The dust had smudged it dark on his palm. His voice carried, steady and strong. "You've all seen enough today. This was never about the law. This was about one man's pride and his cruelty." Murmurs spread like wildfire. Some heads bowed in shame. Others snapped up in anger. The crowd fractured right before her eyes. A rancher barked, "The sheriff keeps us safe." But another man immediately snarled back, "Safe from who? From young girls he takes a dislike to?" A woman clutched her child tight, her voice trembling as she spoke to her neighbor. "It wasn't a sickness, was it? He told us she was carrying a fever that spread through hair. He lied." The word lied carried fast, sharper than a lash. And suddenly tongues were loosened. Whispers swelled into shouts. Hale swung his revolver toward the crowd, desperation searing his face. "Quiet! All of you! Be quiet or I'll—" But his threat broke under the rising tide of their voices. Authority that is built on fear withers and dies the moment the fear is gone. Leora's knees felt weak, her breath shallow. But she found a new strength in the storm that was no longer lashing out only at her. She lifted her chin, her voice thin but sharp. "You cut my hair to shame me," she called out, her eyes scanning the faces in the crowd. "But look, he carries what you tried to trample in the dirt." She turned her eyes on the crowd, and this time, some of them shifted with shame, unable to meet her gaze. Hale's jaw clenched, the veins bulging at his temple. He roared, "Enough! Seize them both!" Two deputies moved, but their steps were slow, halting. Their eyes were flicking nervously at the townsfolk, who were no longer cheering for them. Colt stepped forward. He placed the gathered strands of hair carefully in Leora's bound hands. His voice was firm enough to shake the dust from the air. "It stays with us." Gasps rose. The words carried like a bell toll, and something inside the mob finally broke. A dozen faces flushed red with shame, while others softened, torn between their old rage and a new, terrible reckoning. A young boy slipped free from his mother's grasp. He darted into the street. He knelt by the few scattered strands that Colt had not yet gathered. His small hand was trembling, but he picked one up. And instead of mocking it, instead of grinding it into the dirt, he walked over and pressed it into Leora's palm. The hush that followed burned hotter than Hale's fury ever could. That simple act of kindness weighed heavier than any speech, any sermon. And that's when the sheriff snapped. His revolver snapped toward the child. Shrieks erupted. Mothers grabbed their young. Men shouted, some surging forward in disbelief. Colt's hand shot to his own holster, his eyes flashing like summer lightning. But he didn't draw. Not yet. He held that breathless, terrible space where blood could spill, or mercy could finally rain down. Hale's finger twitched on the trigger, the barrel of his gun gleaming in the sun. And the question trembled in the dust. Would he fire on his own town to keep his power? Or would the town finally rise up and tear him down? The revolver glinted, cruel and cold in the sun, as Sheriff Hale leveled it at the small boy kneeling in the dust. The single strand of Leora's hair was still trembling in the child's hand. The square erupted in screams. Mothers pulled their children back, their faces masks of horror. Fathers shouted in disbelief that any lawman, no matter how cruel, would aim a loaded weapon at a child. The boy froze, his eyes wide, his breath coming in quick, shallow puffs. But his small fingers clenched the single strand of hair tighter instead of dropping it. It was an act of defiance so pure, so innocent, that it silenced the mob louder than any sermon. Hale's voice cracked, ragged with desperation. "Back away, boy. That filth curses all who touch it." But the child just shook his head. His thin voice broke, but it was steady enough to pierce the heart of the crowd. "It's not filth," he said. "It's hers." The words hung in the hot, still air like a judgment. Gas spread through the crowd. Faces paled. Others hardened. The simple innocence of it stripped every last excuse bare. Colt Mercer stepped forward, his hand brushing the butt of his own gun now. His eyes were dark and unblinking. His voice carried an iron calm. "Put the gun down, Sheriff. Even you won't come back from this." The deputies faltered, exchanging nervous looks. Unease was gnawing at them. Even men loyal to Hale knew that no badge in the world could shield a man who shot a child in broad daylight. Hale's jaw clenched, his hand trembling. Sweat was dripping down his collar, but his pride was roaring louder than his sense. He barked, "He's tainted just like her. I'll cleanse this whole town." A ripple of pure fury surged through the crowd. A woman's scream broke first, then a man's enraged shout. "You'd kill a boy over a woman's hair?" The mob pressed forward, their anger swelling, their fear breaking like cheap glass. And suddenly the sheriff's authority was wavering on a blade's edge. Leora swayed, her wrist raw, her body weak. But a fire burned in her eyes as she called out, her voice hoarse. "If you kill him, Hale, then you prove to everyone that I was never the unclean one." "You were!" Her shout struck the crowd like lightning. Murmurs turned to cries of outrage. The voices of the town rose against the sheriff who had branded them all with his petty spite. Hale roared, shoving his finger tighter on the trigger. But Colt moved faster. He stepped directly between the boy and the gun. His shoulders were broad, his chest rising and falling, as steady as a stone wall. His voice came out low but clear, every word cutting through the noise. "If you fire now, Sheriff," he said, "you'll fire into me, and then you'll learn who this town truly fears more." Gasps tore through the crowd. In the hush that followed, even the small boy's panicked breath seemed thunderous. Hale's eyes flickered. His hand was shaking violently now. His authority was slipping away with every heartbeat as the people of his town edged closer, their fury a tide threatening to drown him. The sheriff's lips curled back from his teeth in a snarl. Veins bulged at his temple. With a ragged, desperate roar, he ripped his aim upward. He fired into the sky. The shot cracked like the heavens splitting open. Birds burst from the rooftops, their wings scattering in terror. The acrid smoke curled above the square, and the crowd surged. They were no longer cowed. They were emboldened. Their anger was unchained. Hale's gun wavered. The crowd was closing in. Colt stood unmoving, and the town itself seemed to decide in that one instant whether to topple its own law. The gunshot was still echoing when the crowd surged like floodwater breaking through a dam. Men and women shoved forward, shouting over one another, their fear burned away completely by their fury. These weren't jeers anymore. These weren't whispers. This was rage unchained, and its raw force shook the very foundations of the square. Sheriff Hale stumbled back, his revolver shaking in his hand, his eyes wide with terror, as the faces that had once bowed to him now bore down on him with pure, undisguised hate. "Seize him!" he screamed, pointing a trembling finger at Colt Mercer, a desperate, pathetic attempt to turn their wrath away from himself. But not a single hand moved to obey him, not one man. Instead, voices rose from every corner of the square. "He branded her for spite. He aimed a gun at a child. He's no sheriff. He's a tyrant." Hale's deputies faltered, their boots dragging in the dust. They were torn between their duty and the angry mob that no longer stood behind the badge. Colt remained steady at the center of the storm. His body was a living wall between Leora, the boy, and the fury that was boiling all around them. The strands of hair were still cradled in his hand. His calm was a weight heavier than violence, holding the storm at bay. But Hale couldn't see it. He wouldn't admit it. With a roar of frustration, he lunged, grabbing at the strands of hair in Colt's hand. His fingers clawed, desperate to destroy the evidence of his own cruelty. Colt's arm swung, knocking him aside easily. But Hale stumbled back, only to charge again, froth at his lips. His mind finally shattered by his own humiliation. The crowd roared louder. Some were crying for his badge. Others were calling for his blood. The square trembled beneath their stamping boots. Leora swayed, but she did not fall. Her wrists were bleeding against the rope. Her eyes burned as she shouted, her voice ringing out. "You cut me down to break me, Hale, but you only broke yourself." Her voice struck the mob like a match to tinder. They surged closer, fists raised, ready to tear him apart. Desperation twisted Hale's face. He drew a knife from his belt, its blade gleaming cruelly in the sunlight. It was his last weapon, his last desperate chance to reclaim control. "If I can't burn her shame," he bellowed, spittle flying from his lips, "I'll carve it from her myself." The mob shrieked, a sound of horror and fury clashing as he lunged towards Leora, the knife aimed high. Colt dropped the strands of hair into Leora's bound hands. He stepped forward to meet the sheriff, his shoulders squared, his eyes dark with a final, grim resolve. The two men collided at the base of the porch steps. The knife slashed wildly through the air. Colt's hand snapped out, catching Hale's wrist, locking it tight. The struggle bent them both over, dust rising around them in a choking cloud. The mob pressed in so close the air seemed to vanish. Gasps tore through the square. Women screamed. Men shouted as the knife trembled, inches from Colt's throat. Hale's face was a twisted mask of rage, his arms straining with every last ounce of hate left in him. For the first time, Colt grunted with the effort, his calm cracking into raw strength. The sound drove the crowd into a dead silence. All eyes were fixed on the knife that hovered, glinting, a single breath away from spilling blood. The knife trembled in the narrow, suffocating space between breath and blood. Sheriff Hale snarled like a cornered beast, his face slick with sweat and grime. Colt Mercer's arm was locked tight on his wrist, the dust spinning around them as the crowd held its collective breath. With a roar, Hale shoved forward. The blade sliced close enough to graze Colt's jaw, drawing a thin line of blood. But the cowboy's other hand shot up, clamping around the sheriff's throat, forcing him back, step by agonizing step. The mob surged, their fury spilling into cries. But no one dared to step between the two men. This was the ending they had demanded. Lawman and stranger, locked in a final battle right where truth had finally cornered all the lies. With one final, powerful wrench, Colt twisted. The knife was ripped free from Hale's grasp and flung into the dirt. The steel clattered harmlessly among the boots of the men who no longer believed in the hand that had wielded it. Hale fell to his knees, coughing, spitting dust. His badge glinted as dull as tarnished tin. The roar that rose from the crowd was not applause. It was condemnation. "Out with him!" someone shouted, and another bellowed, "He's no sheriff of ours!" The tide of people pressed closer, but Colt lifted a hand, and his calm, more than any threat, stilled them. And for the first time that day, the mob obeyed. Not out of fear, not out of fury, but out of respect. He turned, his chest rising and falling hard, his sleeve scorched black from the torch, his jaw bleeding from the knife's graze. He found Leora trembling, the strands of her hair still clutched in her bound hands. Slowly he bent down. His fingers brushed against hers as he gathered every last fallen piece from the dust, until not a single strand remained at their feet. He knelt before her, and with hands as steady as stone, he untied the rope. When her wrist came free, she gasped, clutching the bundle of her hair to her chest as if it were life itself. Colt's voice came out low but firm, carrying to every ear in the silent square. "They tried to scatter you, they tried to burn you, but it stays with us." The words rippled outward, sinking deeper than any bullet, silencing the last jeer, bowing the last proud head. Tears finally blurred Leora's eyes, not tears of shame, but of a great weight being lifted. She pressed the strands to her heart. Each lock was no longer a relic of humiliation, but a thread of survival, woven into something that no crowd, no sheriff, could ever steal. The townsfolk shifted, their faces pale with guilt. Some were deeply ashamed. A few bowed their heads as if in prayer. They knew the truth now. The cruelty had been theirs as much as it had been the sheriff's. Hale staggered to his feet, but no hand reached out to steady him. No voice rose to defend him. His badge gleamed once in the light before he ripped it from his own chest, hurled it into the dust, and stumbled away into the alleys like a ghost already forgotten. A heavy silence followed, the kind that comes when shame hangs thicker than smoke. Colt rose to his feet. He offered Leora his hand, not as a savior, but as an equal. And Leora, her hair ragged, her scalp raw, her dignity battered but unbroken, took it. He walked with her across the square, past the porch where she had been shorn, past the dark ashes of the torch, past the spot where the sheriff had finally fallen. With each step, she pressed her stolen hair tighter against her chest. Each step was a silent vow that it belonged not to the dust, not to the jeers, but to her, and to the man who had seen worth in what the world had tried to trample. At the edge of the street, with the dawn light pouring gold over the both of them, Colt touched the bundle one last time, steadying her hands. His eyes were clear and unflinching. "Carry them," he murmured. "They're yours always." And together they stepped into the morning, leaving behind a town that would never forget the day its own cruelty was gathered up from the dirt and placed back into the arms of the woman it had tried so hard to break. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe to Echoes of the West. Now let me ask you a question. If you had seen her hair fall into the dirt, would you have been the one to bend down and gather it?